the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, October the 30th. A few days from you know what. We're changing the subject, though. No, well, not too much American politics. We're talking the Financial Times Best Business Book of the Year for 2024. It's perhaps the most prestigious award. I already did an interview a few weeks ago with Andrew Hill, who organizes it. 6 books on the short list. One of them we've already covered, Tribe, with Michael Morris, an anthropologist at Harvard University. And another of the books we've actually done previously, The Longevity Imperative by Andrew Scott. He was on the show a few months ago, but we got Andrew back because he's on the short list, so he deserves a return visit, a second leg, so to speak, Andrew. I'm not sure if you've looked at Morris's books on tribe and tribalism. It's an interesting take, suggesting that tribalism isn't such a bad thing. Andrew, thinking about old people, and you focus on that, obviously there are young people as well. Are the old, in your view, a kind of tribe?
Well, that's a really good question. I think there's always over time been this sort of tension between young and old. Actually, one of the themes in my book is that the thing that's really changed, the young can now expect to become the old. So we've really got to rethink all of this. Because in the past, only a minority of young people went on to become old. But now in the richer countries, around 50% of young kids can expect to live in their 90s. So actually, we need to think about changing the map of life. But yeah, I think certainly we have developed over time an ageist approach, and ageism works both with the young and the old. And so we ascribe characteristics to each group. And some of those may be touching on something fundamental. Others are rather reductionist.
You've written a lot on this. Linda Grattan's been on the show before, your colleague at London Business School. You wrote The 100-Year Life with her. You also wrote The New Long Life. You're perhaps, arguably, Andrew, the world's leading expert on aging. What's so interesting for you personally?
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if the point of a long life is to write lots of books about longevity. But
well, it works with you.
Well, yeah.
Not that you're so old, of course. I'm not suggesting.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
of course. And the older I get, the more passionately I tell you I'm not old. So it's a really good question. So some of it is sort of just personal. So I spent most of my life as a macroeconomist focusing on budgets and monetary policy. And then kind of in my mid-50s, I realized 2 things. First of all, there's only so long you can talk about whether interest rates are going up or go down before it gets a little bit boring. The second thing was I actually realized that I really quite like big picture multidisciplinary issues as an academic. So that kind of got me interested in longevity. And once you start thinking about longevity, at least in my case, it's hard to think of anything else, because first of all, it's a big aggregate trend. You know, I for the first time ever, the young can now expect to become the old. And I think that changes a lot of things. Globally, life expectancy is now over 70. Globally, not just in rich countries. Global life expectancy over 70. So a young child can expect to become old. So we need to invest much more in our future. And of course, that's about health. It's about money. It's about careers. It's about relationships. So it's about everything. It's about what makes for a good life. But as well as one of those really big, profound trends that's going to change the pension system, the health system, education, it's really personal too. And I kind of got into this when I lost my mother. So I guess at 40 odd, I'm orphaned, as it were. And I was also just looking at my children and seeing them making very different decisions in their 20s than I did, and certainly my parents, and just trying to make sense of it. So I think this is a really interesting trend. I put it up there with AI and climate change as important to society and humanity, but it's also incredibly personal. You know, we all think about birth, life, and what we're going to do in between, and that's what longevity is.
It's interesting, Andrew, you bring up the term a good life. Because we've always, in the Western tradition, been obsessed with the idea or the ideal or the promise of a good life. Perhaps the foundational text in it is Plato's Republic. And I'm not sure if you've read it recently, but I'm sure you have read it in the past. At the beginning, there's a scene in which an old man appears in the narrative, in the dialogue with Socrates. And this old man is presented as someone with wisdom, with the ability to look back. Now, Socrates is, of course, the paragon of wisdom, but I don't think that's founded on his age, although he wasn't a young man. It's more founded on his ability to ask questions. There are others in the beginning of the Republic who were the reverse of wisdom, a fellow called Thrasymachus, who perhaps in some ways reminds us of Donald Trump today. But coming back to the issue of a good life, do you think that age brings wisdom? It's always been an assumption that the older you get, the more experience you have, the wiser you become.
I would like to think that's true, but I think one of the things that I'm very mindful of is that we can't. I think you've got to age in the way you want to age, and if you want to age in a wise way, do it. If you want to age disgracefully, then do it. I think there has been an interesting change in society, because there's an interesting meta-analysis I quote in the book. If you look at American novels, magazines, newspapers from 200 years ago, when older people are mentioned, it's with positive connotations. It's about wisdom, it's about family, it's about civil society, it's about good values. Whereas today, when older people are mentioned, it's normally about care homes, dementia, and things of that form. We've sort of medicalized old age, and it's interesting. In the past, only a minority became very old, live to their 80s or 90s. Now the majority can expect to live in their 80s and 90s, but we worry much more about old age than we used to, and we have much more negative connotations, particularly in the US and the UK. So there's been an interesting shift. The more likely we are to get old, the more we worry about getting old and the less value we place on it. I think that's because we've medicalized old age. We see it only in terms
and
of
I wonder, Andrew, whether this is also, perhaps it's a rather conservative argument, but we shouldn't be shy of being conservatives, particularly old timers like you and I, whether this is also bound up in the cult of youth, which perhaps began in the 60s, especially London was one of the places that invented the ideal or the promise of youth, of teenagers and pop music and all the other cultural accoutrements that went with the empowerment of youth. As we've created a cult of the young and their supposed wisdom, we've undermined the wisdom of the old. Is there any truth in that?
It's interesting, isn't it? I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, I can't believe it is, but that Hugh Grant in Notting Hill is the character is about the same age as Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. And it's sort of interesting if you sort of think about them and the sort of adult responsibilities that they're bearing, etc. So yes, we do skew younger. I think some of that is, partly I think when only a few people get old, those that do survive tend to be really quite strong and in robust health. And we do have a health system that's done a very good job of keeping us alive, but not keeping us healthy. So I think that's one reason why we fear getting old. And that may emphasize the sort of the cult of youth. Innovation, Silicon Valley certainly emphasizes the young. But I think what's tricky here is over the last 150 years, society has become very focused on chronological age. And I know that, that sounds a crazy statement to make, but for most of human history, we haven't known how old we are. We didn't have accurate birth records. People weren't numerate and literate. Even the song Happy Birthday is a 1930s invention. So most people didn't know that they were, how old they were. And then we started to have numeracy, literacy, better record keeping, and administratively became very focused on chronological age. And I think that's been interesting because, for instance, in England in 1601, the Elizabethan Poor Laws, they say, well, how do we look after the poor and the old? And the old are defined not by chronological age, they're defined by people who've been around a long time and who can't look after themselves. And I think that's sort of an interesting concept of being old, whereas now we say, oh, you're 60, you're old. And I think that's part of this sort of fear about getting old. We've switched to something chronological. Whereas I would say there's two other more important concepts of age. One is biological age, sort of how healthy, how are you aging? And the other is how many more years you've got to live. And I think as life expectancy has increased, that's a really important one, because I'm 59, and based on life expectancy data, I've got to behave differently from my father and my grandfather at 59 because I've got more time ahead of me. I've got to invest more in my health, my finances, my skills, my relationships, because I've got more years ahead. And I think that's a really important shift. So in a way, I can't afford to be too conservative or living in the past, because the older I get, the more years I've got ahead compared to the past.
But isn't your London Business School identity coming to the fore here, Andrew? It's all very well for you to say, well, I'm going to live longer than my father or grandfather. I need to make plans for the future. I know you got bored doing figuring out mortgage rates, and that's why you focused on longevity. But no one ever knows. You get hit by a car as you walk on Marylebone High Street this afternoon. God forbid, of course. But it's all very well talking about data and birth certificates and aging. Those are concrete, but no one ever knows when they're going to die.
No, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is, let's take one of the implications of longer lives is the finance sector. In the 19th, 20th century, we developed a life insurance sector because there was a high risk of dying early and your family being left financially vulnerable. Now, if you look at the data, actually the really big risk is dying most people die above the average life expectancy. So, in the UK, I think it's the government says 1 in 10 people will live to be 100. How are you going to finance a 100-year life? You can't save enough for a 100-year life. So I think the risks have actually switched the other way. There was a very high risk of dying young, and now there's a very high risk of dying very, very old. And I just don't think as a society we've adapted to that. So yes, it's risk, it's probabilistic, and you've got to balance the short run and the long run. It's just the long run goes on for a lot longer. I start the book with a Sam Beckett quote. Humans give birth astride the grave. The light flickers an instant, and then it's dead. Then it goes. Well, the light's flickering quite a lot longer, and we've got to adjust to that reality. So we can't be quite so in the moment. I do wonder sometimes if, for most of human history, we had a strong belief in religion and spent a lot of time every day preparing for what would happen were we were to die today. I wonder if this is why we spend so much time in the gym and worrying about our health, because now we think we might be living a lot longer.
Well, not only that we think we're living a lot longer, but we don't think there is an afterlife. We're not prepared for it, most of us. Or certainly I know in Western Europe and the so-called coastal elites in the US, at least, they're not particularly religious. They don't believe in the idea of heaven or hell. So they live their lives on earth, and that's it. And then the light, the candle goes out, and the next.
But it is interesting. For most of human history, we haven't associated. I mean, of course, when you're old, you're more likely to die, but you had a very high risk of dying at all ages. One of the extraordinary changes has happened is that now we associate old age much more with death than before, because you're much more likely to die now when you're old than at younger ages. And I think that may have also played into some of those secular trends that you talked about.
I wonder if there's a contradiction also. I think that our culture, our broad sort of globalized upper middle class culture, the kind of people who come on my show, people like myself, we're all a bit averse to risk. So as life becomes less risky, we're more sensitive to risk. It's rather like bringing up kids. Everyone now is obsessed with their kids being, sexually abused or kidnapped or any of these things. They don't let them out on the street. But actually, in the old days, things were much more dangerous for kids, and no one ever worried about them.
Yeah, but I think, again, this is an interesting one, because you said earlier about being conservative. And of course, traditionally, older people are seen as being more conservative, more set in their ways. But I'm obsessed with longevity, so I'm going to spin the question around a different way. If you've got more time ahead of you, you can actually take more risks. So I think we're going to have to make sure that as we're living longer, we actually look for a little bit more risk, look for a little bit more change, or else you can become very set in your ways. And that's a problem in the labor market because your skills are out of date. But also, it's a risk of getting a bit bored yourself or being boring to others. So going back to the thing about people being younger, the sort of fetishization of youth, I think one of the things that a longer life requires is people being more open to change at all ages, because you've got more time to pay back. It's a very economic point of view. but with a longer horizon, you can take more risks.
Yeah, and you can think very creatively. I know you do in your book and your work about going back to university,
Yeah.
about education, about quote unquote retirement. I want to talk, Andrew, a little bit about the politics of all this. You've referred back to the middle of the 20th century, the high point in some ways, I guess, of industrial civilization in the US, the age of the New Deal in the UK, the age of the welfare system that was created after the Second World War. Was it coincidental that as we began to, as age began to be, so to speak, datafied, as we had birth certificates and as we could remember how old people were, we got a welfare system that very often focused on age as one of the variables that determined whether or not the state should, again, interfere or support you, and whether or not, as we get to the second quarter of the 21st century, that welfare New Deal state is being replaced by something else. It's kind of in crisis.
Well, it certainly is in crisis, and one of the crises is the pension system or social security, which, of course, when a pension was introduced, and it was quite late in the US, around 1930s, it was sort of set at 65, and life expectancy wasn't much higher than 65. But now when it's sort of high 80s, you're clearly got more and more time being spent not working. And if you factor into the baby boomers, there's a lot of older people, not just more people living longer, but that big cohort living longer. Then you get these pressures on the pension system and on the health system. So that's what's called the aging society story, which is always a tale of doom and gloom. My take on it, of course, is if we're living longer, we'll make sure we're healthier and productive for longer, because if we're living longer, we need more resources over our lifetime to support it. But it is putting a massive strain, because we created a three-stage life in the 20th century of education, work, and retirement, and it really hasn't adapted. And I think that's a really, really big problem, because governments around the world are raising the state pension age, the age at which you can get Social Security. And there's so many issues with that. The first is that although it solves the government's financing problem, because you have to be older to get a pension, it doesn't help people work for longer. Aged 50, about 80% of Americans are in work. At age 65, it's down to about 30%. And that big exit from the labor market is not people mainly saying, oh, I can afford to retire. It's they lose their job because their skills are out of date, because of ageism in the workplace, because they're ill, or they've got to care for someone who's ill. So, just pushing out the state pension age doesn't make us productive for longer. The second really big issue, I think this touches onto what you're saying, is that we're aging really differently. And as a university professor with good education and good income, my life expectancy is much more higher than someone without those advantages. I think in the UK, North and South Kensington, the difference in life expectancy is about 10 or 11 years. These are two regions cheek by jowl to one another, just very different income.
That's like Palo Alto and East Palo Alto.
Exactly. And I think in the US, I think the difference, the top 10% of income and the bottom 10% of income in life expectancy is, I think, 10 for women and 15 years for men. So if you just keep raising the retirement age, you're basically going to be wiping out retirement for a group of people. And that's wrong. So I think one of the things we've got to try and face up to is actually, because we age very diversely and we are aging differently, we can't use age as a simple indicator to say that's a person's needs. Just as you don't say, oh, everyone over 40 needs the same thing. Not everyone over 70 needs the same thing. Not everyone over 80 needs the same thing. And this is this problem with relying upon chronological age. It's a pretty poor indicator of a person's character and needs.
Yeah, it's all very well you saying that, Andrew. You're a professor at London Business School. You're not running for office. If a politician said, well, actually, some 80-year-olds should get pensions and others shouldn't. If you've lost your hair or you weigh under a certain amount, you're not getting it. And if you go to the gym every day, you will. This is an enormously complicated and potentially just a massively interesting political issue. I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation, but if Trump does what he says he's going to do on the economic front, and he does indeed, as some economists now are warning, particularly in reputable newspapers like The Economist, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, and essentially busts the social security system, will he be kind of creating the crisis that for analysts like you aren't actually a bad thing, because they're recognizing that at some point or other we've got to deal with all this stuff?
Yeah, and of course, what's interesting about the US is actually in some way, I mean, I think the US in some ways does things quite well already, in the sense that a lot of Americans work till they're quite old, and so they are creating resources over a lifetime. I think the challenge is there's sort of two types of people: those like the university professors who can work till they're very old and want to, and have a nice job which is very age friendly, and then those who have no choice but have to work and probably aren't working in very nice jobs and are struggling. So there's a bunch of issues there. I think where the US doesn't do so well is its life expectancy is about 8 years less than most other high income countries.
Which is astonishing. Say that again, Andrew.
So US life expectancy is about 8 years below the
So what that means is that we have an international audience. The American listeners or viewers on average will live less, 8 years less than those from the UK. Or
well, actually the UK is not so great, but so Japan,
so
Germany,
what's an
Italy,
average? I assume Japan's one of the models.
Yeah, Japan is the highest life expectancy. But a more striking statistic, perhaps, is China's life expectancy is higher than America's, and its GDP per capita is a sixth of America. So China really has higher life expectancy.
Say that again. Yeah. I mean,
China's life expectancy exceeds that of America's, even though its GDP per capita is only a sixth of America's.
And how would you explain that?
Well, I think a lot of it is to do with inequality. Actually, those at the top are still sort of living the length of life that you see in many other high-income countries, but you're seeing a ever-widening gap. And famously, in a few years, US life expectancy fell, and this is not to do with COVID. And if you look closely at the numbers, it wasn't life expectancy at 65 that fell; it was life expectancy at birth. So this is the a rise in midlife mortality that is happening. Angus Deaton and
Angus, he always comes up. Deaths of despair. He won the Nobel Prize. A Scot. Yeah. I once called him an English economist, and someone told me off. He's actually a Scottish economist teaching at Princeton now.
Yeah,
and his wife, of course, Anne Case, who works with him on all this stuff.
Exactly, and he's focused on that. But there's also, and the UK is as always, it's somewhere between Europe and America, but getting closer to America on these trends. But obesity trends are worse in the UK and the US than elsewhere, and there's a big socioeconomic gradient to that as well. So I think that's a big part of it.
Should we be working then? I mean, the more I listen to you, Andrew, I wouldn't say more attractive my own death becomes, but perhaps more attractive the deaths of others. Maybe not deaths of despair, opioid deaths, or suicides. But should we be focusing on trying to get people to live longer? Now there are these drugs. You talked about obesity, which is one of the I'm guessing one of the main reasons why Americans live less, because they're much fatter than other people. Should we be embracing these new drugs, or are they actually only going to compound all the problems of longevity that you're warning about?
Well, let me sort of feed it all in, which is that, for most of human history, we haven't had the expectation of living long lives. A 15-year, I'll give you Swedish numbers, but just I got them ready to hand.
Not Danish. I would thought the Danes are always the model for everything.
Yeah, but I want to go back a long time. So in 1851, a 15-year-old in Sweden had an 11% chance of making it to the age of 80. 11% chance.
11 to get to 80. So 1 in 10 Swedes got to be 80.
From 15. Of course, there's a lot of infant mortality, so I'm ignoring that. So just from 15.
Right.
In 1951, you had a 1 in 3 chance of making it to 80 if you were 15 in Sweden. And today, assuming no further progress, you've got a 3/4 chance. And I kind of talk about this like sort of London weather, and you're a Londoner, you're like me, you come from North London. It's a rainy city, so if there's a 10% chance of something happening, if there's a 10% chance of rain, I don't bother with a raincoat or an umbrella. If there's a 1 in 3 chance of rain, I'll take a small umbrella. If there's a 75% chance of rain, big raincoat, big umbrella. And my simple point is that's what's happened to longevity.
That's astonishing. So just to be clear here, if you're over for the over 15-year-olds in Sweden today, 3 out of 4 of them are going to live to be more than 80. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's assuming no further progress in medical technology. So the GLP-1s, if they're going to help us, it's going to be more than that. In fact, if you look at most of these high-income countries, they claim that 50% of kids born today will live to be into their 90s, high 80s, early 90s. So we just got to invest in those later years, and we've never done it before. So, of course, the problem we got at the moment is if we underinvest in our health, if we underinvest in our skills, if we haven't got the resources, then living a long time is not great. But I would say, well, if you think death is a better outcome than living longer, we perhaps need to change a little bit the structure of life and find ways of making sure we live healthily. So we definitely have a problem with the medical system, because the medical system has done a brilliant job of getting global life expectancy to 73, but it's done it by keeping us alive, not keeping us healthy. And we cannot carry on going down that route, because otherwise we're going to have lots of 90, 100-year-olds with dementia who can't move. And that's not good. We've got to make sure we actually focus on keeping people healthy for longer. We've also got to make sure that we don't have ageism that says old people can't do things or their skills are out of date. We've all got to make sure we've got opportunities to do things whatever our age is. And I don't think that's a radical statement. We've got to make sure that we support a long life. And we can't improve. I mean, you can improve how people age when they're 80, but it's a lot easier to start when they're younger. So we've got to reconfigure the map of life. That's kind of what we need to do. And it's, of course, that's an outrageous statement to make, because it covers
and it's
everything.
easy for a business professor, but in the middle
Well, we
of
did it in the 20th century. We did it.
Well, Andrew, I don't want to keep on going back to the US election, but it's an enormously important issue, for example, for the future, certainly of America.
Yeah.
And yet it's not something that one of the 80-year-old, well, there's one 80-year-old running who won't acknowledge his age, and a younger woman who is ageist, unembarrassedly ageist. And yet it's not an issue that is ever in any way addressed by these politicians. And I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of discussion about age in the recent UK general election, was there?
Yeah, no, there wasn't, no, and in fact, of course, the extent to which it's normally negative and assuming that more old people is a problem rather than anything else. Let's go back to the 20th century and the changes that happened there. I don't think it's an election that solves these problems. So in the 20th century, we invented teenagers, we invented retirement, we extended school leaving, we introduced the state pension. By the time 1965 comes along, we invent a midlife crisis. So, it's a long period of change, which we adapt to growing life expectancy. In that case, it was the chances of living beyond 60. And we started to see a bunch of legislation, a bunch of social norms and market and individual changes that over a big sweep of history created the life that we now recognize. And I think we're going slowly through that same process. But your point about the US health system, I would say, is always featuring in elections, because the US health system is becoming ever more expensive and delivering ever worse health outcomes as it keeps people alive.
And it's part of it. I mean, would it be fair? I know one or two old people who seem to rack up. I mean, if they had to pay for their healthcare, they'd be probably spending millions of dollars. I mean, these people seem to treat it like a free, I don't know what you call it, a free slot machine where they just go to their doctor every day.
Yeah, well, I mean, the US.
I'm not saying it's only old people, but I'm guessing it's the old who put more of a burden through Medicare, which is one of the one of the few sort of holy trinities of the American political system. Even Trump won't say a bad thing about Medicare.
Yeah, well, the US spends about 2 or 3 times more on health as a share of GDP than the UK and most other countries. And as we just said, is not delivering very good outcomes in terms of life expectancy or health. If you got the best treatment, you can do very well. And you just talked about some people.
Well, that's the inequality stuff that you've been talking about.
Well, that's the access stuff. But it's interesting in the UK where we don't spend that much, although we have spent a lot more by our standards recently. But the NHS here is failing. And it's failing because it's very focused on treating disease. And if you've got an aging society, you're going to see ever more people with aging-related diseases. And the health system has done a brilliant job keeping us alive by intervening when we get ill. But if you do that when you have aging-related diseases, you don't make people healthy again. You just keep them alive for longer till they get another disease. So the whole health system really isn't about health. It's about disease. And we need to somehow switch to prevention. And I think that's going to be, you're already seeing some of that happening a little bit in the marketplace outside of health, like food, drink, wearables, exercise, things like that. but the health system itself is still really focused on disease. And I think until we shift that, we're not going to be achieving healthy, longer lives.
Andrew, I mean, as you know, in Silicon Valley, I've done a number of shows with Silicon Valley utopians, really, who believe that we can live forever. In fact, there have been some books on that. I'm sure you're familiar with them. Should we be a bit wary of that, both the promise, but also the reality of technologies, particularly in biotech, that might indeed allow us to live forever, or certainly to 150 or 200? There's, of course, Ray Kurzweil, still alive. He was on this show back in 2011. He'll probably be on the show in 2111. I won't, but he will. So should we be a little skeptical of the Kurzweilian view of aging?
Well, you know, the oldest person ever to have lived to 122 years and 164 days. So we know that's sort of humanly possible, but no one's ever lived beyond that. So I think being skeptical of living vastly greater than that is right. For me, the most important thing is not to live longer, but to live healthier for longer. And right now, you know, what's happening is that for most of the 20th century, life expectancy gains were increasing your chances of living from 30 to 60. And that was great, because 30 to 60 are years where you're in relatively good health and you're also working and producing resources to finance a longer life. What's happening now is life expectancy gains are actually slowing down, but all the life expectancy gains are really coming from the chances of making it from 70 to 90. And that's a problem, because those are years that tend to be in declining health and where we're not working and not creating resources. So we've really, I think, got to focus not upon extending how long we live for, but saying, how can I remain healthy for as long as possible? Because health is incredibly valuable.
Isn't health relative as well? For some people, you know, the positive, the optimistic, those people with agency deal very well with being unwell. And sometimes a certain kind of old, maybe not always such old person, is such hypochondriacs that even a cold will be treated as if they're dying.
Well, it's quite interesting. What you sort of see is that people sort of, you know, health, of course, varies across people's life. Some people are born very healthy. Some are not blessed with such nicer health. But actually, what seems to matter more is not what your level of health is, but its declines in your health. So people sort of go around relative to a baseline, which is why aging becomes an issue, because as you get older, your health tends to decline. So it kind of has the same effect on everyone. So if you are a hypochondriac, you worry about your health, you'll be worried early on, but then when your health starts to decline, you worry even more. So it's about trying to stop those years of decline and make healthy life expectancy catch up with life expectancy. What I worry about with the Silicon Valley lot is that if you're, you know, a billionaire and you've got loads of resources, everyone at your beck and call, you probably maxed out in terms of your life expectancy through eating kale, you know, all that sort of exercising.
The Peter Thiel model.
Yeah. So what you're going to be really interested in is radical life extension. And I suspect, who knows if it's possible or not, but I kind of think that the thing society really needs is a pretty simple treatment like a statin or even a GLP-1, if that's the case, that actually gives 3 or 4 years of extra healthy life to millions of people, getting them to be healthy into their 60s and 70s, rather than can we push the boundary up to 120, 130. And if we are going to live that long, let's hope we crack how we work that long, because if you know, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion, if we're living for longer, you need more resources over that lifetime. Now, in the 20th century, what was great, we had rapid productivity growth. And so we didn't actually have to work many more years in the 20th century, even though we were living longer, because productivity growth gave us all.
We like work, Andrew. I'm guessing you're never going to retire. I'm certainly going to avoid retiring if I can possibly. I think who wants to retire? I mean, I don't even know what this word means now.
Well, I mean, and it's a bizarre word, isn't it? Retire. The idea of withdrawing is wrong. I mean, the only thing I say about work is that, you know, I enjoy my work and I have a job that I can carry on working as I get older. Not everyone enjoys their work or can do that. If you're doing construction work, you can't carry on working. I think the really important thing is you need to be able to finance a long life. And of course, that requires money. But also it's engagement. It's a way of having a sense of purpose and a sense of engagement. If you're lucky enough to get purpose and engagement whilst you make your money, then that's the jackpot. But we've also got to think about actually how we just keep people engaged. Now, it's really important to stress that work in terms of salary is great, but it's also a sense of why should I get up? And there's plenty of evidence that says if you've got a reason to get up in the morning, you're going to live longer because you
Don't
just
we need to teach old people to leave the stage? We've had the problem Nancy Pelosi, Biden, Trump.
Yeah, this is a really interesting
Ruth
one.
Bader Ginsburg, a particularly catastrophic example. The old people now control real estate in America, so young people can't buy real estate. Is there a problem with our generation? You remember the generation that Keith Moon wrote about in the 1960s, The Who? This generation getting too old. He wrote famously, or The Who famously sang about, hope I die before I get old. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And now we own all the resources and young people can't buy real estate. They can't get jobs. They feel that they're finding it harder and harder to get into politics. Is there a dysfunctionality when it comes to the economic or political power of the aged?
This is a really big topic. And there's clearly problems. I think you've got to dig a little bit deeper to see what's happening. So the first issue is, it's interesting. If you look at, say, the US Senate, there's a lot more older senators than there used to be. But if you look at the population, it mimics the population. There's a lot more older people. And in a way, that's kind of democracy. You have a representative group of people. And as long as they're capable, then that seems to be representative. What is interesting in the US is that in Europe, prime ministers and presidents are getting younger. In America, they're getting much older. So I don't think this is necessarily to do with an aging society. It may be something to do with US institutions, and perhaps it's to do with the party system, the fundraising. And what you've got to make sure is that everyone's voice is heard. And so you may need to change those rules to make sure that younger voices are heard. So it's not the same everywhere. In terms of older people owning property, I think there's two things happening here. The first is there's a lot of older people because the baby boomers are a big generation, so they own a lot of wealth. If you look at it per capita, they don't earn much more wealth than they used to. There's just a lot of them. The other thing that's happening is, my father started work at 14 and was married at 17, I think. I started doing that stuff in my early 20s and my kids later. So you're seeing a change in the life cycle as well. This, none of which is to say that young people have got it easy. I think there's real problems because I think what's happening is as older people work for longer, it's not creating unemployment amongst the young, but it's creating some career blockages. And I think you can see that in academia. So I think what we've got to do is create what I'll call age-friendly jobs, where you say, look, if you want to carry on working, here's an attractive option. It's much more flexible. There's more autonomy. It pays less, but you can move into those jobs. The other thing we've absolutely got to try and do, and again, this is going to be a huge shift, is I don't think we can afford to have hierarchies so much. Max Planck, the scientist, said science advances one funeral at a time. It's only when the old person dies that the new ones can get their voice heard. Well, if the old are now dying at 97, and I think that was how old Queen Elizabeth was when she died, when Prince Charles became king at 73, that's a problem. So I think we've really got to work on this intergenerational diversity. And I think one of the really big changes we've got is, for most of human history, there haven't been many old. There's been lots of young. And so young people dominated political voting. Now,
they weren't even thought of as young. When you write your academic essay on that, Andrew, you can call it Walk the Plank.
But what's happening?
At least you compared yourself to your father, but at least your father saw Spurs win the double.
And as a young man as well.
Sacrifice 30 years of your life for that, or at least win something.
Yeah, no, that would be good. It keeps me going. I'll probably still be going at 150.
You and I will live, even if we're still around in the middle of the 22nd century, Spurs will have won nothing.
That's my
final question, Andrew. There's so much to talk about here. We'll have to get you back on the show. I got the sense, I know you probably don't want to get involved in politics, but you're probably suggesting in your own quiet, polite way that people should vote for Harris. She's the younger candidate. You talked earlier about aging disgracefully. Do you think somebody like Trump is an example of how we age disgracefully?
I think, surely what makes a good life is to be able to do what you want to do when you can do it, subject to your own moral code and values. And I'm sure Trump is doing that.
And I was thinking of putting, if I use that as a title for this interview, then you'll get 10x the audience.
Yeah, I'd rather not. No, I don't, by the way, think younger candidates are necessarily better than older candidates. I think what is really interesting about age is that, I said earlier about Elizabethan poor laws, that old were people who've been around for a long time and couldn't look after themselves. When you look at these things more closely, there's lots of people who are old, but we don't draw attention to their age. Mick Jagger, I think, would be one who, we go and see Mick Jagger because he's Mick Jagger. But when people have a problem, and Biden would be an example here, then suddenly age becomes the focus. And I think, whatever you think about Trump, his age is not the thing most people focus on. It's Trump himself.
He's escaped. Yeah. He's done a deal with someone, probably the devil, about not aging. It's interesting. A final question. You bring up Mick Jagger. Another example is Bruce Springsteen. I went to see him recently in San Francisco. He's in his mid-70s. And he still did the crowd walking thing, and he jumped off stage. And I was
4 hour set,
and I was surrounded by people my age who were clearly trying to become young. I have to admit, I was rather disappointed, even sort of horrified with the whole thing. Why would you have a man in his mid-70s jumping off the stage and walking through the crowd? And the reality was that, he's about in as good a condition as anyone in their 70s could ever be, but he still needed a couple of minders to help him do that. Why can't the Jaggers and the Springsteens of the world age gracefully? No, leaving aside the disgrace, but isn't that one of the problems, is that guys like Mick Jagger and Bruce Springsteen, there are models for better or worse, and they're failing to age.
Yeah. So, I'll just go back. So Cicero writes a book on old age, and he talks about all the advantages of old age, and he sort of turns it around and says, well, you can just sit down and think quietly. You take satisfaction in small things. And I find that as a university professor very appealing. But, I don't think there's one way to be old, just as there's no one way to be a teenager. I think in the end, it's going to be up to your preferences. And I think that's the key thing about how we deal with a longer life. You've got to make it your longer life, and you've got to go down the path that you think is the right one for you and those around you. So, I don't know. I think we shouldn't be prescriptive about how we age, just so we shouldn't be prescriptive for what you do in middle age. You can have your views and your values, but each to their own.
So reasonable, Andrew. I hope that will be the speech. Have you prepared your speech for winning the award in December? I think the awards are at the beginning of December in London for the FT Book of the Year.
No, I certainly haven't prepared a speech, but I'm looking forward to the night, and let's see what happens.
Well, Andrew J. Scott, real honor. Another Spurs fan, one of the afflicted. We feel each other's pain. The author of The Longevity Imperative, shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year award. Certainly, I think you'd get my award for the interview of the year. I'm not sure. There are lots of other books, but yours is as good as any of them. The Longevity Imperative, Building a Better Society for Healthier, Longer Lives, critically important issue that politicians don't always address. Andrew, as always, a real pleasure. Good luck with the awards, and we'll talk in the not too distant future. And as we say, we hope Spurs will win something also in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always a pleasure.
I'm ready to attack. Andrew King. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He is the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.